What's up, guys? It's Mayutava. Today we'll compare RESPs and rental properties. So this one's really for parents in Canada that really feel the pressure to help their kids get ahead. And I was talking to a friend yesterday, and the reality is having kids in today's world can be as expensive as you want it to be. And so I say that to kind of preface this entire video with saying the entire rental property RESP, all of these are great to have, but they're by no means like a need to have. Right? So I don't want anyone to feel guilty if you're not doing this. You know, it's definitely a luxury product, what I'm going to be describing today. Okay, so here's a little backstory. I went to Laurier back in 2010. So it's been just over almost a decade and a half, which is kind of crazy. My sister, who was 1 year older than me, went to master in Hamilton. We both grew up in Markham, Ontario. And so I still remember just being very surprised that my dad was able to cover our living costs for both me and my sister. So OSAP paid tuition, which was just barely enough, but we got by. And at that time, tuition was something like $3,000 a semester. I'm sure it's way higher now, and I'm sure it's gonna be way higher even in the future as well, right? But OSAP would cover tuition. My dad would cover our rent. And so that left us on the hook for kind of food, entertainment, books, which a lot of times, like during university, you have various side gigs, random like things that you do to make money. And then we had co-op terms as well. So I was able to graduate with about 10 to 15,000 of debt, if I'm not mistaken, which we paid off relatively fast, right? But I still remember being amazed and grateful that he had the ability to cover our living costs. And so for me, as a child of immigrants, you feel this need to then provide even more for the next generation that comes after you. And so today, the reality is it's going to be the same cost: tuition, your residency, your food costs, your entertainment costs, and whatever else that really exists. But it's just the reality is today's a lot more than it was 15 years ago. And I'd be willing to bet that in 20 years from now, it's going to be even higher. But now you have to add to that uncertainty. Will the next generation even go to school? Is university going to be the way to go? Is it going to be all universities are held equally? Are there just going to be some major universities that are worth the tuition fees that you'd have to pay, and some are just not worth that at all? Is there truly going to be trade schools, which the government's pushing everyone into anyways? So is that going to be the method? And if you go back like 3-4 years ago, it was, hey, these certification programs are going to completely eliminate universities, which doesn't really seem to be happening, but that was a discussion. And then there's going to be those people that choose not to even go to school. Maybe the money's going to be used for starting up a business, just used for the down payment of the purchase of a house, wedding, whatever you and your kids decide, the next generation decide is going to be a reasonable usage of those funds, right? And this strategy gives them the flexibility to determine exactly that. You don't have to use the rental property funds for education under a program guideline that the government deems is reasonable. Now, I'll caveat that with saying I do think the right approach is a combination of an RESP and a rental property. And it gets a lot easier when you have multiple kids. But I've told everyone around me with kids, and no one really listens to me. About 99% of people don't listen to me. And of the 1% that do listen to me, they think that this is out of reach. So this entire video is really explaining to you RESP versus rental properties and why it's completely within reach for you. So I'll walk you through what your RESP portfolio will likely look like if you start on day 0. I'll walk you through kind of the returns that a rental property will likely look like. And then you can kind of decide for yourself. I'm a numbers guy. So for me, it's black and white. Either the numbers make sense or they don't. I speak a little bit fast, so I've got a presentation with the numbers, there's entire model analysis behind it. Ultimately, this is just educational. It's something I put together for myself more than anyone else, myself, friends, and family. But I realize there's a lot of value behind it, so there's really no point in just gatekeeping this. So RESPs versus rental properties, mortgage strategies with Mayutava. So it all starts with assessing what is the real cost of education going to be 20 years into the future. And this is extremely difficult to do, right? But the number that I'm ending up at is somewhere between 135 to 145,000 as a cost of an undergrad with residency in the future. So how do I arrive at that? We start off at $7,000 a year in tuition costs, and then $12,000 a year for kind of your residency costs, your books, etc. So in total, arriving at about $20,000 a year. If you take that and then you apply an inflation rate of 3% per year for the next 20 years, you arrive at $144,000. I personally think 3% is way too low. I know the government will tell you inflation is somewhere between 2 and 3%, but I don't really believe that, right? You have a couple of years of these 6, 7, 8% that propels you so far into the future that now you're compounding on an even higher rate. So let's say our future cost is actually at an inflation rate of 5% per year. Well, that now means your total cost of education is going to be $213,000. It's crazy that just a 2% can have that big of an impact, but it's a reality. Okay, so let's just run for the case of this argument that our future cost for education is going to be $144,000 a year. So next question, logically, should be, how much do you end up with an RESP? So parents on average, you should be contributing about $2,500 a year in under ideal circumstance. And the reason you do that is that the government then adds their 20% kind of matching, which is, it works out to be about $500 a year. So if you put in $2,500, the government puts in $500. So total kind of contributions for your child is $3,000. If you invest that for 18 years and you start on day one, which I know most people don't, but for argument's sake, then the future value of that money is $102,611. And we arrived at that future cost using an 8% growth rate. Okay, so it assumes that whatever you put your money into under the RESP, it grows at 8% per year. If you're putting it in a GIC, you're likely going to be way below this. And if you're putting in some high risk fund, well, we have no idea where you'll really end up, right? But the future value of this is $102,611, which is great. That's more than I had. It's more than a lot of people have. And that's more than enough on your job as a parent, in my opinion, right? So you could completely stop here. And I think that's more than enough. The monthly cost to do this is about $302.32. Now, there is a shortfall, which we are factoring into that monthly cost. And the reason is this. You see this $144,000 as a future cost of education. If we want to make sure that your child has enough money, you take this $2,500 contribution and then you add another $94 on a monthly basis. So on a monthly basis, you're putting $208 into their RESP and you put another $94. So a total of $302 into an investment account that will allow them to have $145,000. Okay. So from here, let's talk about rentals versus RESPs. It's really no secret that ultimately I'm a real estate guy. I like my rental properties. One of the main reasons in this example of RESPs versus rentals is that you can use the rental property funds for whatever you want. It's not restricted to a certain type of program. It's not restricted to you having to take out the full amount of money in a certain period of time. You have ultimate flexibility when you choose the rental approach. The second is that you can pull out the funds in a tax efficient manner. You don't need to pay income taxes on this money when you borrow the funds back out from the rental property, as long as you do so using a refinance. You can also pull out the funds while leaving the asset invested. So what that means is if you own the house, 15, 18 years down the road, you can pull the money out with the refinance and the asset is still invested. It's still ideally cash flowing, still generating you some type of income, and you can continue to hold that. The RESP equivalent would be if the government would let you kind of pull out funds from your funds while leaving the funds invested, kind of like a margin account, which they just don't let you do. The fourth approach is that the tenants will ultimately pay down your mortgage. They will help you carry the cost of your rental property versus in the RESP, it's all you kind of contributing to it. And if any given year you miss your RESP contributions, that completely throws off your end result. Versus with the rental property, the pay down and everything behind it is basically forced upon you once you've done the hard work of buying the house. Number 5, there's also options for your family to keep the property for later. If you guys want, you can co-own it. You can just give your child their share of the money and you can kind of continue to own the property after, or you could sell it whenever you want in the future as well. But the key is with rental properties, there is always risk. And that's not to say RESPs have zero risk. That wouldn't be fair either. RESPs have risk of whether or not the stock market does good or bad. And I remember going into undergrad in 2010, I guess 2007, 2008, 2009 would have happened just before I went into undergrad. And it would have happened literally just before my sister went to undergrad. Now thinking about it in hindsight. And I remember it being a discussion that my parents didn't want to pull the funds out of the RESP because the stock market at that point was doing terrible. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. There is risk whichever way you go with this, whether it's rental properties or RESPs. So now let's go through a quick example. Okay, let's call this the Johnson family example. Obviously completely made up, has no merit. It's just to show you guys numbers. Okay, let's look at the financial comparison of what would happen if they went to an RESP or a rental property from the perspective of the Johnson family. Just for a general post-secondary degree, not some crazy med school, law school, dental school, whatever. With the child moving out, living in residency and going to school. And we're going to assume they begin starting saving as soon as the child is born for 18 years. Okay, and we're going to maximize the government grants of 20% as well. So this model that you guys can see right here, this is exactly what I was talking about, right? So it outlines for you the future value of the RESP versus the rental strategy. So let's say, for example, someone lives in BC, they're contributing $2,500 a month at a monthly contribution rate of $208.33. The government is giving you the top up of $500 per month. So your total annual investment, $3,000 over 18 years at 8% leaves you with $102,611. Now, because we said the future cost of education is $145,000, that leaves you with a shortfall of $42,388, which requires an additional annual contribution of $1,131, which works out to be $94 on a monthly basis. So as long as between our RESP contribution and our shortfall fund contribution, we're putting in $302.66, and as long as we hold an 8% rate of return, and as long as the future cost of education does not exceed $145,000, we will be fine. So now let's look at it from a rental purchase perspective. Okay. I'm going to make a couple assumptions here, but the first assumption is our interest rates are 4.5% and the HELOCs rates are at 5%. Then we take the monthly RESP payment, and that's just coming directly from here, which is under our RESP scenario, what we would have to contribute on a monthly basis. And I'm just dividing that. I'm taking the RESP contribution of 302.66, multiplying that by 12 and dividing that by 0.05 to say that I could have a home equity line of credit of $72,600 and pay $302 per month instead of doing my RESP contributions. That's all this needs, right? Now, to get a serviceable home equity line of credit, it does require you to have equity in your home. But if you don't have equity in your home and you have other funds that you want to use for the down payment of the rental property purchase, that's no problem either. And that actually even further amplifies your rate of return. And then beyond that, I'm assuming we use a 30-year amortization. And then really the question becomes, what kind of a purchase price can we aim for? So the purchase price of $363 that I'm going to use in this scenario is based on most lenders wanting you to put 20% down payment for the purchase of a rental property. So if you take $72,637 and you divide that by 0.2, you end up at $363,186. I rounded that down to $363,000. Okay. And I am also making an assumption that you will have the money for the closing costs on the side. If you don't, that's something else that needs to be factored in. Now, in all scenarios, you're going to incur a couple of expenses related to your rental property. The first of which is going to be your mortgage expense. Now, with the rental property, you are going to incur the expenses on a monthly basis. So if, for example, you got an 80% loan to value mortgage on the $363,000, you're going to have a monthly payment on that mortgage of about $1,500 between your property tax, your maintenance, your management fees, etc. All in, you end up needing to get a rental income of about $2,600 a month to cover the full expenses related to that property. Okay, so that's pretty key. Now, you might be looking at me, some people are going to be from Toronto, Vancouver, and they're saying, A, there's zero chance I can buy a property for under $363,000. B, there's no way I can buy a property for $363,000. That can be rented out for $2,600 per month. And I'm here to basically tell you guys that is 100% possible. It's just not going to be possible in some of the largest cities in all of Canada. You do have to look outside of your horizon. Canada's a huge country and there's multiple markets there, and it is 100% feasible. I have those properties. A lot of people in my network have those properties. And I think a lot of you guys watching this video, it's probably not going to catch you guys by surprise. A couple more assumptions we have to make. So I do assume marginal tax rates are 40%. I do assume the property market will appreciate at a rate of 2% per year. And I assume that rental rates, that's a monthly rent, will increase at a rate of 1.5% per year. I think this is pretty conservative. You know, you can kind of play around with your numbers later, and I'll break down various scenarios for you, okay? So we already know that under this scenario, we end up with $145,000 if we contribute $302.66 per month. Now we need to look at what happens to our rental property scenario. Okay, so in our rental property scenario, we bought the property on day one for $363,000, and we had a mortgage for $290,400, and this is our $72,000 of down payment that was sitting on the HELOC. Now we're going to skip ahead to year 18. So 18 years later, at a 2% property appreciation rate, the property goes from $363,000 to being worth $518,000. You can see that right here. The mortgage, which started off at $290,000, 18 years later, will be down to $163,000. And so at that point, you have equity in the property. Okay, that's the gap between the $518,000 and the $163,000. You have equity in the property of $355,000. If you did a refinance on that property, they would give you a mortgage for 80% of the $518,000, but you do have to account for the mortgage that you've already used up, which is $163,000. So what's left for you to pull out is an additional $250,000. Now, maybe from that $250,000, you take back your $73,000 and you pay off your home equity line of credit. You're still left with about $180,000 available to you, and you're left with locked in equity, that 20% that the bank never let you touch, which is about $103,000. Now, beyond that, what I would actually do is I wouldn't sell the property. I would be pulling out the $145,000 that we need for school. And if you pull out $145,000 at, let's say, even, I don't know what you guys want to use, but let's say 6.5%, $140,000 times 0.065 divided by 12 is about $800 more per month. So then if you pulled out $145,000 and your payments went up by even $800 a month or whatever you want to use, the next thing you need to look at is, what is my rental rate going to be 18 years into the future? And so if in today's world, we rent that property out for $2,600 per month, in 18 years into the future, that rental rate will now be $3,348 per month. Now, keep in mind your costs like property tax, insurance, maintenance costs, stuff like that will likely go up as well. But at the same time, your mortgage payment has likely come down, right? So the difference between the $3,348 and the $2,600 is roughly $748, which is exactly enough to account for the $145,000 that we're now pulling out. But your original mortgage would be smaller. This is assuming we did a refinance on everything. Okay, so at the end of the day, if you go with the rental approach, you still continue to own the asset. The asset would still be cash flowing 18 years into the future. You can then decide whether you want to pass that on to your children, whether you now want to keep the property for your own retirement, whether you guys want to co-own it, whatever you decide to do, you have ultimate flexibility, regardless of whether or not your child went to school or not. So in summary, if you'd gone the approach of putting the $302 into your RESP and an additional fund on a monthly basis, you would have had about $102,000 in your RESP. You would have had the remaining roughly $43,000 in the additional fund that you would have had. Instead, if in year one, you opted to buy a rental property for $363,000, use the $300 and so month on a monthly basis to put a down payment towards the property, then the end result in year 18 is that even after you pulled out the available equity and then you paid for the $145,000 roughly, you would have still had about $100,000 of equity available to you, which you can then pay down to $75,000, which still leaves you with about $30,000. And most importantly, it continues to leave you with the property to decide what you wanted to do. And most importantly, it leaves you with the property and the additional 20% of locked in equity in that property as well. You can sensitize this however you want. You, generally speaking, end up ahead with the rental property unless you use some aggressive assumptions, such as assuming that the rental market in 20 years will be lower than it is today, assuming that real estate values will be lower than it is today, assuming that the stock market does a 15 or 20% yearly return for you, right? If you make these kind of assumptions, and honestly, rental properties just likely aren't for you in general, but for the rest of us normal folks, this could make a lot of sense, and I highly encourage all of you guys to look into this. And like a lot of investing in real life, whether it's crypto, stocks, real estate, whatever it is, the earlier you get started, ultimately, the better your returns will be, courtesy of compounding returns, right? But don't worry too much about what the market is doing today. When you have a long enough horizon, time is ultimately your strongest strength. So if you found this helpful, hit the subscribe button. I'm going to be aiming to do more content like this on a weekly basis, whether it's real estate, personal finance, mortgages, and more. So make sure you guys hit that subscribe button. Thanks, everyone.